With our history of philosophy course. Now, if you've had any courses with me in the past, you may be thinking, what is going on with the surroundings? And that would be a legitimate question. So, first, let me go ahead and say that I'm out of state currently. So, I'm not in my normal study where we would normally be filming and recording our lectures. However, that's okay. We can continue on with our course here. Um, and by next session, I'm sure we'll be back to our regularly televised location, right? Now, having said that, the history of philosophy it's a massive course. It's a massive undertaking, and it can be done in a couple different ways. And this will usually depend on your professor. It will usually depend on um, the prerogative of the individual that's teaching the course. And obviously, I'm going to fall under that category this in this instance, right? Now, usually what's done when you're teaching the history of philosophy, and it could even be history of modern philosophy, history of ancient philosophy, it could be contemporary philosophy, study of contemporary philosophy. But usually what is done is either one of two approaches. You will either have a very wide survey of the era that's being discussed. In this course, would be history of all philosophy, right? Um, and so you'll either have a very wide survey with many thinkers, or but not as much depth, or you may have just a few select thinkers, philosophers from each particular era, and a little more depth to that. Now, the way that I'm looking at this, the way that I'm leaning towards heading in our discussion here in our course here is, for the most part, calling a couple significant thinkers from each particular era, and then looking a bit at those thinkers. Um, However, there may be more eras, because again, remember, we're not just doing this, isn't just a history of modern philosophy course or a history of ancient and medieval philosophy. We're doing the entire spectrum, right? So it may be that I combine that methodology, meaning it may be, as we kind of walk through and feel our way through the course, what I feel like may be more pertinent to what's going on here, to what your immediate interests may need to be, what may help you in your particular area. It may be that we get to one particular era and we do a wide range of thinkers, but not as much depth. And then it may be a different era of philosophy that we get to, and then I just select maybe one, two philosophers or thinkers from that particular era. So it may be something of a combination between that. And again, this is usually highly subjective or contingent upon the professor or the instructor that's taking you through the course, um, in in your journey here. Now, having said that, let's go ahead and move into our first slide here. And I'm going to try to keep this brief as something of an opening type lecture. But I want us to look at what we're gonna peruse from 1,000 feet above, right? And I like to kind of give that example and to put it that way, um, for the following reason. If you're like me, hopefully you're not, but if you're like me, and you're interested in, say, you go on a vacation or you go to some new location, and you like to get on Google Maps, right? I mean, this is just a wonder of technology that we have now, that you like to get on Google Maps, and wherever it is that you're going, after you find your directions to that particular place, you like to look at the layout of the area from 1,000 feet above, right? I mean, you can literally do that with Google Maps. You look at the town, you look at the locale, and then you can narrow down, you can focus in on where you're actually going to be at your final destination there. But one of the reasons that you might like to do that, or at least the reason I like to do that, is because not only do I want to know exactly where I'm going, but I want to know what the layout is wherever I'm going. Where are where the something as practical as a grocery store? Where are the roads that connect to the place where I'm going. If I need to take an alternate route, what are the attractions, or what are the things that may be around that I may be interested in while I'm there, right? Um, in other words, I want to get a feel for where I'm going, not just the exact location, but the area around where I'm going. I want to get a feel for that location. I want to get a feel for what's going on, not just here, but around it during the same time period, all of these sorts of things, right? And so when we talk about philosophy, a lot of times it's good to get 1,000-foot overview first before you descend down into a particular era, or descend on a particular thinker. Um, because we're going to see that philosophy is very rarely, if ever, done in a bubble, right? A cultural vacuum. So much philosophy is going to be contingent upon the ideas that were preceding the new idea that came about. So it's not necessarily as you've got this thinker that's just sitting around in his hotel room, right? And he is all alone with his thoughts, and he just comes to boop, have uh, some new outlook, right? Not just some little insight on some particular matter, but an entire outlook. Usually, the case is that when we see someone develop a philosophy, and here philosophy, I'm using the term right now. I'm using the term in the sense of a worldview and an outlook, as a way to explain reality, how we experience reality in some sense. But usually, when we see that, it's going to be in regard to the ideas that came before. Now, this is a good thing, because once we somewhat understand the progression, the track record, right, the trajectory, it's easier to understand a particular philosopher. That is to say, you don't have to necessarily try to remember what one guy thought, because when you think of that one guy, you're already in a line of thinking, um, of which he's following and reacting to, or adding to, or trying to counteract or go against something in that nature. So again, this 1,000-foot above um, idea, I think is pretty beneficial. So let me check our internet connection here, because it looks like that we're says we're full strength, right? But it looks like gate from this gauge here that my mouth is not matching my the vocabulary that's proceeding from it. Right? Hopefully it's working out. Now, just to give you again just one quick example, let's say that I want to talk about the epistemology of David Hume, right? Well, before we would talk about that, I would want to give you again 1,000-foot above view of just what epistemology is. What do we even mean when we're saying that? Because again, even though this is a history of philosophy course, this may be the only philosophy course, or it may be your first philosophy course that you've taken. So stop doing that thing. So this may be the first philosophy course that you're taking. So some of these ideas may be new to you, and I hope you pick up something from this. And even if this isn't your first philosophy course, I'm hoping that you'll obviously pick up something as well. Now, let's look at our first point on the slide here, or actually the second point. How relevant is the study of ideas? Now, if you've already taken the Worldview course with me, you'll recognize uh, that I'm not asking something new here, right? When we talk about how relevant is the study of ideas, this was one of the first questions that we asked in the Worldview course, right? Because worldview is just the study of systematic, particular ideas, right? And when we see that, when we look at it in that course, we see that the ramifications, the consequences, the logical implications that result from someone's worldview or someone's philosophy in this context will have major consequences. As has been said numerous times, ideas have consequences. Let me say that again, just in case you were tying your shoe or whatever. Ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. And that is just simply to say that when one proposes or puts forth a new idea and then others adopt that idea, it's very easy to see, given enough time, right, the logical implications for those ideas and how they play out. For instance, right now, just to kind of give you a teaser, did you know that most of this controversy, at least at the time of this recording, in my culture, most of the controversy about whether or not marriage entails a man and a woman, whether marriage can simply entail two men or two women, also whether or not gender is necessarily connected to biology, or whether that's just a construct. Those two issues, essentially, right, the revisionist view, right, that marriage doesn't necessarily entail a man and a woman, and biology does not necessarily coincide with gender. Those two new views, those newer views, for the most part, embrace or assume, I should say, not necessarily embrace, but assume, presuppose an idea called nominalism, right? That is to say, if nominalism is true, well, then marriage may as well entail the same sex, right? And gender may not necessarily have anything to do at all with biology, if nominalism is true. Now, however, what if nominalism is false? What if there's a such thing as what if moderate realism is true, or what if realism over and above moderate realism? What if that's true, right? Well, then it wouldn't necessarily follow that gender is not necessarily connected to biology, and it wouldn't necessarily follow that marriage is simply a construct, right? But however, if you're not familiar with those categories, right? If you're not familiar with the history of thought, right, the history of philosophy, well, then those types of conversations are just going to be that much more difficult for you, simply because we don't know where those ideas are coming from, and we don't know perhaps the potential problems that were encapsulated, or that were not encapsulated, but that were hindering the original worldview, the original philosophy, of the original thinker's ideas, that would have not let that even begin, right, had those been addressed previously. Now, again, when we talk about how relevant is the study of ideas, and we say, again, ideas have consequences, there are logical implications. Think about cinema, television. Again, this is not a new idea. This is something I've brought up in the Worldview course, right? Is think about the impact that this has played on cinema and television, right? Again, we can just go back to those two cultural hot button topics that we just brought up. How many cinematic pieces, how many movies, how many television entertainment shows that were set for entertainment, how many are those two topics, how many shows or movies are revolving around those types of issues, or revolving around those types of philosophical outlooks in regards to gender and or / marriage, right? I would say there's numerous, right? Numerous television shows, movies, songs, right? Even songs that are revolving around these topics, these ideas. And guess what? These are all the implication of a philosophy, right? These are all the implication of ideas that have preceded us in some sense, right? Now, again, we look at legislation, we look at government. We could use the same two topics when we talk about legislation, the law for or against the traditional view of marriage in contrast to the revisionist view of marriage. Government, right? Should government have any part in marriage or gender or any of these particular topics that we've talked about thus far? When we talk about philosophy and we talk about right or wrong, we're simply talking about ethics, right? This ethics is just a sub-discipline of philosophy that asks questions about what do we do in certain situations, what makes what we do in certain situations either morally right or morally wrong, or correct or incorrect, right, in regards to moral questions, right? And then, of course, meta ethics would just be to simply question the entire process to begin with. What is right or wrong? What is good, right? Now, again, when we go through the history of philosophy, these topics will continually um, rear their heads. They continually come up over and over and over again. And again, because these are simply the ideas of others put into play as we go through the history of philosophy. And again, you're going to see how much of these topics are either responses to previous thinkers, or, and that may be for the positive or for the negative there, they may be trying to counteract responses from previous thinkers, or they may be trying to add on or to contribute to what they think is a good uh, insight or thought in regard to a previous thinker. Now, how do we know things, right? How do we know what we know? Or how can we even know that we know, right? These are issues in epistemology and metaphysics. And again, the history of philosophy, you're going to see these types of questions, these types of issues come up over and over and over again, and they're going to be answered in one way or the other, contingent upon the thinker that is trying to offer his thoughts on the matter, right? And again, so many times, so often, this will be in as a reaction to a previous thinker or what's going on in his culture, which is even what's going on in the culture is the result of previous thinkers, right? Ideas that have trickled down through the university, down into the lay level, right? Down into the working man's world, so to speak, right? Now, it should go without saying that God is one of the perennial, right, uh, uh, issues that comes up within any type of philosophy course. It's hard to imagine studying the history of philosophy, studying philosophy, what any era of philosophy, without the topic of God not being discussed by the thinkers within those um, within those eras, right? Now, there are going to be some eras where the topic of God is going to be center, right? It's going to be central to the discussion. And that's not to say, I know so many are thinking, oh, well, that's probably going to be because in particular eras, everyone believed in God. And so it just revolved around, that's not necessarily true at all. You're going to have eras, well, that's a little Freudian there, but we're going to have eras in which ancient eras, old school eras, in which there wasn't a belief um, that physicalism was false, right? There were eras, even back in the day, right, even old school, so to speak, that thought materialism was actually true. Physicalism was the truth about reality, and yet you would have thinkers in those particular in those particular days and age that thought some sort of theism, right, was true. That that realism not only entailed the reality of the physical, right, the material existence, but also the non-material realities, immaterial realities that did, and in fact do, exist, they would argue. Now, I'm going to put a special spin on this right now in the regard that if you are a Christian theist, right, then this particular topic in regards to God is going to be of more significance to you in some sense, right? Now, I would argue, right, as a theist myself, that and that shouldn't be a shock to you, right? I would argue that this is going to have significant um, impact on your philosophy, uh, whether you realize it or not. So there may be some that are philosophers in some regard that say, yes, I'm a philosopher, I'm a thinker in my day and age, yet I don't give the topic of God that much thought at all. Well, my argument would be simply that depending on your presupposition or your assumption in regards to that question, right, whether God exists or doesn't exist, even again, if it's just well, I know God doesn't exist, so I carry on with my philosophy, not giving a second thought to that. I'm going to agree with Mortimer Adler here that said that the way that one answers that particular question, well, let me back up. He was asked the question why his topic, the God topic, in his, you know, what's the word I'm looking for here? I don't want to understate it, but I'm going to end up understating it here. During his synopsis of world history and philosophy, it was noticed that the God section included the most material. And when asked why this was, he said roughly, and I'm paraphrasing here, that depending on how one answers the God question, will have more implications for anything else by far. Right? There'll be more implications that result from, there will be more consequences that result from how one answers the question as to whether or not God exists than any other question that you could possibly answer. There'll be more that will come from how one answers that question than how you could than any other question you could possibly ask. And so I agree with him on that. Now, again, some may say, well, I just know that God doesn't exist, and I roll with my philosophy from that, with that just somewhere in the background of my noetic structure, and I don't give this question any other thought. Again, my argument would just simply be no. The way that you arrive at these other answers to questions is going to be directly impacted based off your assumption that God doesn't exist, right? So, having said that, this is something of 1,000-foot, a view from 1,000 feet above at some of the issues that we're going to run into as we discuss the history of ideas, right? The history of philosophy. Now, some of the topics here will be of more interest to you than others. There may be some of you that are just simply enthralled with philosophy no matter what era it comes from. Now, and that may or may not be the case. Excuse me, it's getting late for me here. Now, that may not be the case that you're interested in every era of philosophy. But I will say this, that even if you are somewhat very interested in philosophy, don't be surprised if there are particular eras or even possibly topics that just don't, float your boat, as someone like my dad used to say, right? That don't get you as excited as other areas. That's completely normal. That's fine. Even someone like myself that's supposed to be teaching philosophy, right? There are some thinkers that I just don't necessarily get as thrilled about. There are some ideas that I think are so silly it's almost difficult to entertain them. But that's not to say that there are intelligent people that stand exactly on the opposite side of the spectrum in that regard, right? And so you and I even may cross paths in that sense, that we come to an area and like, oh yeah, this is what I'm looking forward to, and I choose that happens to be the era when we go through more of a range of philosophers as opposed to the depth, right? And that's okay. I mean, it's kind of like how Scripture says that the body, you can't say, the hand can't say to the foot that I don't need you because I'm not a foot, right? Or the finger can't say to the eye that I don't need you, right? The body works, it coincides together. So there may be even that among us, right? Even among you and I here as we go through different ideas, different topics, different eras within philosophy, different thinkers. Now, hopefully, this is my hope, that the areas that I end up concentrating maybe or perhaps a bit more on, I'm hoping that those are going to be, there's going to be a widespread interest there. That, right, no matter what particular era of philosophy you enjoy or what particular thinker you enjoy, I'm hoping that if we do narrow down on at least a particular aspect or or issue within philosophy, that will be something that's more widespread. There's more interest there. I'm hoping for more people than not, right? Now, we could easily go ahead and just end this first introduction type lecture, and I think that we may go ahead and do that here. Let me scroll down here. Now, what I'm trying to do, and what I want to make sure that I do, is to finish up any concluding thoughts, right? As we round out this just introduction, easy for me to say, this introductory lecture on the history of philosophy. Let me do that. Let me do an outro by way of this. Let me go ahead and toss out some of the names that I'm absolutely confident that we'll discuss. Right now, we may talk about other philosophers, right, other thinkers as well. But just so you have something to whet your appetite here, I know for a fact that we're going to discuss Socrates, right? I don't see how you could take any philosophy course at all without discussing Socrates. I don't see how you could eat pizza, right, without discussing Socrates. That's just how important I think Socrates is in the discussion of ideas here in history of philosophy. Of course, we'll mention his disciple, Plato, right? We'll mention the disciple of Plato, Aristotle. I lean heavily towards Aristotle. I think he has a lot to say in his view of reality, metaphysics, ethics. I know for a fact that we'll discuss Thomas Aquinas. I know that we're going to discuss David Hume, right? Famous or infamous skeptic, right? Depending on what side of the aisle you're on there. We're going to talk about issues such as metaphysics. We're going to talk about issues such as epistemology. We may even toss in some philosophy of religion. Of course, we've got an entire course dedicated just to that particular topic, but we'll probably talk about some philosophy of religion as well. We may talk about, well, first, I know that we'll talk about Descartes, right? Rene Descartes. We'll talk about Jean-Paul Sartre, maybe one of his contemporaries, Albert Camus, possibly Bertrand Russell. Tom Nagel. I'm trying to think of a couple different names from each era that I know that we would talk about, right? Possibly Wittgenstein. Anyway, there's a couple names, a couple topics that we'll talk about: ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, some of these different things that we'll talk about in here within the history of philosophy. And again, the reason I'm all over the place here is because, again, this is just the type of course that we're covering so much ground that at the very best, I'm hoping to just guide us through in some sense. And then at the same time, of course, pull a lot of your context and a lot of your content and from your reading. That's going to be key here is your reading. Now, I know that we already have our textbook, but there is one that I really, really, really want to recommend, that if you do ever catch any free time, which you probably won't, but if you do, I would really, one of the most fair, one of the most balanced, but one of the most quality pieces of literature that you can buy on this, aside from Copleston's History of Philosophy, would be, in my opinion, William Lawhead's Voyage of Discovery. Now, that may be a bit pricey. It's sometimes still, I guess at least as of this recording, it's still considered to be an academic work and used primarily in academic context. So it may be a bit pricey. But if there's any way you can grab a used copy of that, find it somewhere, maybe a Goodwill, Salvation Army, something like that. That's just such a great, fair, and balanced discussion of the entire history of philosophy. It's not as long, obviously, as Copleston's, but it's just very qualitative, very quality, very substantial. There, a lot of quality, a lot of substance there. So if you can find a copy of that in your spare time, which you, again, probably don't have the spare time, but if you can, and you want to go even deeper with one particular thinker that we mentioned, that's going to be a great resource for you. So if you can pull that out, I would definitely recommend that. Now, what I'm hoping to see in light of the discussion boards is there's going to be most likely a lot of things, again, stuff that we talk about here that you can mention in the discussion boards. And what I really want to see, and sometimes I've seen this go very well, and there's other times where it's just been, almost as if they're just crickets, right? I want to see you guys bounce back and forth a lot of these ideas, right, in your discussion board. Now, at least of this recording, you're being graded for the most part on your interaction with one another in your discussion boards. You're not necessarily being graded on whether your idea is terrible, right, or whether you have a fantastic idea. It's just that we're just looking for this interaction here. Now, a history of philosophy course is going to be the easiest courses to toss ideas back and forth. What you thought about some particular topic, what you thought about some particular issue, where you hope the trajectory may continue to go from that point. So I'm really hoping that you guys will offer up a lot of good substance, or in-depth, substantial type of discussion and remark in regard to our lectures and your readings here. Again, remember, you're not necessarily so much as right or wrong. Well, you are very well. You could be terribly wrong or absolutely correct. I just meant to say that in regards to the grading, right? We're not grading so much as if you're right or wrong in your answers. We're grading on the interaction. So don't necessarily worry so much about, at least for the context of this course that we're recording right now, don't necessarily worry about so much whether you're right or wrong in your assessments. But simply we want to see if there's a healthy, robust, and of course, kind reaction going on here in the discussion boards. Again, history of philosophy course is going to give you tons of material for this interaction. So having said that, we'll wind out this first introductory course, and depending if I'm back in state, we'll be in our normal surroundings. Have a good one. See you next time.